Welcome back to the deep dive. I hope you are somewhere comfortable right now. Maybe you've got a glass of wine in hand, or maybe you are just settling into your favorite chair with the lights dimmed low, because today we are going to need you to be really relaxed. But we also need your mind wide open. We are returning to the Seth material, specifically session 300 from the early sessions, book 7.
It is so good to be back. And, you were totally right about the atmosphere. This particular session, which was recorded on November 7th, 1966, has such a specific vibe to it. It is intimate, it is philosophical, but it is also incredibly practical. It sort of bridges the gap between the structure of the universe and, well, the morning news.
Exactly. And before we get too deep into the weeds here, I want to make sure we set the ground rules. This podcast will be distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes. We are exploring this with full credit to the Seth material and the publisher, New Awareness Network.
Right. And as always, we are just guides here. We aren't the source. If this sparks something in you, and I really suspect it will for the learner listening today, you absolutely need to go to the source yourself. You can find these books and more at sethcenter.com/the early Sev sessions.
Okay, business aside, let's talk about session 300. Because when I was reading through this, I felt like I was watching a mystery movie, a philosophy lecture, and a supernatural thriller all at once.
It really runs the gamut, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, we have a discussion about reincarnation that somehow involves a vacation to Puerto Rico. We have a very intense, almost just detective noir moment involving a hit-and-run accident with a cat. And then we end with a psychic parlor game where a disembodied consciousness reads the Sunday New York Times through a sealed envelope.
It sounds chaotic when you list it out like that, but there is a very clear thread that connects it all together. It is all about perception. It is about how consciousness interacts with physical matter, whether that is a soul entering a body, an emotion hitting a cat, or a mind reading a newspaper without physical eyes. It is all the exact same mechanism.
So let's start with the big picture stuff, the metaphysics. Because Seth opens this session with a bit of a bombshell regarding reincarnation. I think for most people, the learner included, we tend to think of reincarnation as this massive epic cycle. You live, you die, you go to a holding area, you review your life, you come back. It is a distinct timeline. It feels, I don't know, heavy.
Right, we view it as a linear progression of distinct events. Life A, then death, and life B. It is the classical view. But Seth immediately dismantles that distinction. He says, and I quote, "Reincarnation and projection, you see, are one and the same thing. They simply appear to be different."
That is a huge statement. Reincarnation is just projection, like astral projection.
Precisely. And this is where we have to slow down and really chew on what he is saying. He is saying that the mechanism you use to leave your body during a deeply altered state or a vivid dream is the exact same mechanism used to enter a new life. He points out that, as a rule, the ego is not aware of its departure from one physical organism and its growth into another. He says this is a projection.
Okay, but hang on. I can project, hypothetically, lay on my couch, close my eyes, float around the room, and then snap back to my body in 20 minutes. Reincarnation is, well, it is 80 years. It involves diapers and taxes and arthritis. How can those two things possibly be the same?
That is the friction point, isn't it? We judge the event by the time it takes, but Seth argues that time is just a matter of focus. He says the years of growth that we experience, growing up from a baby to an adult, those are an illusion of the system. He literally says the journey itself is as instantaneous as a projection from here to, say, Puerto Rico.
I have to pause on the Puerto Rico thing. It is just so funny to me. You are talking about the migration of the eternal soul, this great cosmic mystery, and Seth compares it to hopping a flight to San Juan.
It is incredibly disarming.
Yeah.
And it is effective, right? He is trying to strip away the mystical fog. If you project your consciousness to Puerto Rico, you are shifting your focus from here to there. Seth is saying reincarnation is just a shift in focus that you decide to stick with for a while. You are simply delving more deeply into the moment point in the reincarnational instance. In your terms, you are just staying there longer.
Staying there longer. That is such a cool way to put it. So life is just a projection we haven't snapped back from yet.
Exactly. Think about it. When you project, say, in an out-of-body experience, you usually maintain some tether to your physical body. You know you have a self back on the bed. But in reincarnation, you act as if the self on the bed doesn't exist at all. You become fully immersed in the new environment. But the act of getting there is identical. Imagine you go to Puerto Rico on vacation.
Yeah.
You were there for a week. You know you are going home. Now imagine you go to Puerto Rico, you lose your passport, you get a job, you marry a local, and you entirely forget you ever lived in New York. You are still just projecting yourself into that location, but your focus has become total.
That makes the physical body feel very temporary, like a rental car.
It is. And Seth reinforces this idea throughout the material. The body isn't the origin of the self. It is just the vehicle the self is currently driving in this specific time zone.
But why? Why do we do it? Why go to Puerto Rico? Why go to Earth? Seth throws out this term, value fulfillment. And honestly, when I hear that, I think of a corporate HR seminar like, have you achieved your value fulfillment metrics this quarter?
It really does sound a bit bureaucratic. But for Seth, this is the fundamental law of physics and metaphysics combined. He says value fulfillment is the law of the universe, and it appears as growth within your system.
Okay, let's unpack this, because growth usually implies getting bigger or better. Is he saying we are here to improve our souls, like we're in some sort of remedial school?
No, and that is a really crucial distinction for the listener to grasp. The school metaphor is super popular in New Age circles, the idea that you are here to learn harsh lessons. Seth doesn't subscribe to the idea that you are broken and need fixing. Value fulfillment is more like, think of a seed. A seed doesn't grow into a tree because it wants to be a better seed.
Right, it just grows.
It grows because the data encoded inside it, the value, literally cannot be contained. It must express itself. It must unfold.
So it is an explosive drive.
Exactly. It is the drive of consciousness to explore every possible nook and cranny of its own potential. We project into these lives, these Puerto Ricos of the soul, not to pass a test, but to fulfill this innate drive for experience, to unpack the data compressed inside us. Seth says this appears as growth in our three-dimensional world because we see things getting bigger or more complex over time. But in the spacious present of the universe, it is simply expansion.
So we aren't trying to become perfect, we are just trying to become more.
Yes, more in terms of breadth of experience, depth of feeling, complexity of understanding.
And understanding this entirely demystifies death. That is the big takeaway for the listener here. If reincarnation is just a projection, and you can learn to project now while you are still alive, then death really loses its sting.
Seth actually says that outright. He tells them, literally, death will no longer appear frightening.
But I could see that being a terrifying thought for some people. If I'm just projecting into a life, does that mean my life doesn't matter? That I am just daydreaming? That none of this is real?
Seth anticipates that fear, and he flips it. It is not that life matters less. It is that your existence is far more durable than you think. If you practice projection, if you practice shifting your consciousness away from the physical body, you realize that you are not the body, you are the traveler. The body is just the vehicle you were renting in Puerto Rico. When the rental contract is up, you don't cease to exist. You just step out of the car. The experience you had in the car was real. The miles you drove were real. But you are not the Chevy Malibu.
I am not the Chevy Malibu. I might have to put that on a t-shirt. But it leads to the next logical question. If we are just travelers projecting into this reality, how do we make it feel so intensely real? How do we build the solid world around us? Because this table in front of me feels pretty solid. My wine feels wet.
This brings us to the core mechanic of Seth's philosophy, which he reiterates clearly in this session. He says, expectation is behind all sense data.
Expectation is behind all sense data. That is one of those sentences you have to write down and stick on your bathroom mirror. But practically speaking, what does it mean? I don't expect to see a red car, and then poof, a red car appears in my living room.
It is not quite that cartoonish, no. But it reverses the common view of reality. We usually think, I see the world, and then I form an opinion about it. The data comes in, and I process it. Seth says, no, you form an expectation, a deep subconscious belief template, and that expectation manufactures the things you see. The data goes out. He says your physical condition in every way is a reflection of your inner expectations, accomplishments, and failures.
And he doesn't pull punches here. He talks about illness, too.
He really doesn't. He states plainly that any illness is the result of an inner distortion.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. That can be a really hard pill to swallow for people. It sounds dangerously close to victim blaming. Oh, you have the flu. Must be your distorted thoughts. You broke your leg. What is your inner failing? It feels harsh.
It absolutely can feel that way if you look at it through the lens of moral judgment. But Seth isn't judging. He is diagnosing mechanics. It is like saying, if you touch a hot stove, you will get burned. It is not that you are a bad person for touching the stove. It is just the physics of heat transfer. Seth is saying that the body is a massive feedback mechanism. If the inner self is distorted, if there is deep fear, rigidity, repressed anger, it has to go somewhere. The value fulfillment drive pushes it out into the physical system.
So the illness is actually the solution, or at least the physical expression of the problem so you can see it.
It is the pressure valve. It is the inner reality becoming outer reality so you can finally look at it and deal with it. And he mentions that sometimes this distortion is actually a hangover.
A hangover from a previous existence, yes.
Right. Just like you might wake up groggy after a long night out, your soul might enter a new life still carrying the mood or the unresolved issues, the distortions of the last trip. You are still projecting the old patterns until you realize you are in a new place.
Speaking of patterns and ideas, I love that Seth takes a moment in this session to do a literal book review. Jane, or Rupert, as Seth calls her, was reading a book called The Power of Universal Mind by Muriel Noyes-Gilchrist.
I love when Seth plays literary critic. It shows his personality so well. He is not just a disembodied voice dictating laws. He has opinions on contemporary literature.
And he gives it a bit of a mixed review, right? He says he has given the intellect a whacking many times in the past, but he actually defends it here.
It is a very nuanced critique. The book apparently focuses heavily on the divine spirit and intuition, perhaps at the expense of critical thinking. Seth says, the intellect has been trained, unfortunately, to deal almost exclusively with the results of sense data. This does not mean that it cannot and should not do more.
So he is actively defending the intellect.
He is. And this is where Seth really separates himself from the typical guru crowd. Usually, spiritual texts tell you to silence the mind or kill the ego. Seth says absolutely not. He critiques the author for suggesting we should just float in a divine bath of intuition. He argues that the intellect is the sharpest tool we have for organizing reality.
So we shouldn't just bliss out on a mountaintop.
No, Seth calls that inane simplicity. He wants a balanced understanding. You need the intuition to perceive the inner reality, yes, but you need the intellect to make sense of it, to organize it, to navigate it. If you abandon the intellect, you become a ship without a rudder. You might feel good, but you aren't going anywhere.
He also critiques the author for ignoring reincarnation entirely.
Right. He notes that this is actually the author's last reincarnation, which is a fascinating little piece of cosmic gossip. She is making her final contribution. But because she ignores reincarnation in her writing, Seth feels the work is incomplete. He insists that reincarnation belongs both with metaphysics and psychology and simply cannot be ignored.
That is an interesting pairing. Metaphysics and psychology. Usually we keep those in completely separate buildings on the university campus.
For Seth, they are the exact same field. You cannot understand the human psyche without understanding the history of the soul. If you ignore the previous selves, you are trying to analyze a person while ignoring 90% of their history. It would be like trying to explain World War II without ever mentioning World War I. You just can't do it accurately.
Okay, so we have established that we are projecting souls, creating our reality through expectation, and that we need our intellects to navigate this projection. Now let's zoom into a very specific, very physical example of this from the session. The incident with Catherine the cat.
This is, in my opinion, the absolute emotional anchor of the session. It takes these abstract metaphysical concepts and makes them incredibly visceral.
So for the listener, let me set the scene. Rob and Jane have a cat named Catherine. They come home, and the cat is missing. Jane, who usually doesn't do this, gets this sudden urge to go check the clothesline with a flashlight, and she finds the cat hiding.
And the cat is badly hurt. She has a broken pelvis.
Rob suspects a car hit the cat. And in the session, Seth confirms it. He says, a man in a gray sedan took out his momentary resentment upon the cat.
That phrasing is chilling. Took out his momentary resentment.
I have to stop you there again, because this sounds dangerously close to what we were talking about earlier with victim blaming. It sounds like the guy got out of his car and physically kicked the cat because he was mad. But that is not what happened, right? It was a vehicular accident.
Correct. It was a collision with the car. But Seth is analyzing the energy of the event, the underlying physics of the emotion. He says the man was filled with resentment. Maybe he had a bad day at work. Maybe he was fighting with his spouse. We don't know. But he was a giant ball of negative energy rolling down the street in a gray sedan.
And the cat.
Seth says the cat accepted this simply because the resentment was too huge for him and he was snowed under.
Snowed under. That image really sticks with me. It implies that the emotion had actual physical weight to it.
That is exactly the point Seth is making. We tend to think of our emotions as private, internal weather. I am in a bad mood, but it doesn't affect anyone else. Seth is saying that is fundamentally false. Your emotion is a physical force. It radiates. His driver's anger was so massive, so intensely projected, that when the cat's path crossed the car's path, the cat didn't just get hit by metal and glass. It got hit by a literal wall of human resentment.
But again, I struggle with this idea that the cat accepted it. Why do we need to bring energy into this equation at all? A 2-ton car hits a 10-pound animal. That is just mass and velocity. Isn't Seth overcomplicating a tragic, random accident?
That is the materialist view. And it is valid if you only look at the surface mechanics. But Seth is asking us to look at the probability of the event. Why that cat? Why that driver? Why that exact fraction of a second? He argues that the driver was projecting a field of aggression so intense that it magnetically attracted a victim. The cat wasn't guilty, but it was energetically available to that frequency. The cat's consciousness was smaller, less structured, and it was overwhelmed, snowed under by the sheer force of the human's emotional projection.
It makes the cat sound almost like a martyr.
In a way, yes. Innocent or smaller consciousnesses can sometimes be overwhelmed by the intense projection of a more complex consciousness. The cat was simply in the wrong place, energetically speaking.
But then Seth flips the camera back to the driver. This wasn't a hit and run where the guy got away with it, at least karmically speaking.
Not at all. Yeah. Seth says, the man, seeing the results, was subconsciously but clearly brought face to face with the size of his own problem.
Wow, so the physical impact, the terrible sound of the thump, seeing the injured animal, that shocked the driver into realizing, my God, I am carrying so much anger.
It forced the internal distortion to become an external reality. That is what Seth means by creating reality. The driver's anger had to manifest. It was too big to stay inside. Unfortunately for Catherine the cat, it manifested right there in the street. But the feedback loop was instant. The driver now has to deal with the guilt and the shock. The universe literally held up a mirror to his resentment.
It is a really heavy lesson for the listener. Your road rage or your bad day isn't harmless. It's creating a hazardous environment. You are essentially driving a tank made of anger.
It raises the stakes of emotional responsibility entirely. If you knew your bad mood could literally break bones, you might be a lot more careful about how you process it before getting behind the wheel.
But there is a silver lining here. Seth tells Rob and Jane that the cat wasn't hurt just to give them a chance to be nice, but that they can actively ensure its recovery.
Yes. He says, the greater your understanding, the more you can uphold and support without depleting yourself. This is a key instruction for healing. Rob and Jane can use their positive energy, their support, to counter the damage. They can help the cat rewrite its physical reality towards healing. They can provide the counter energy to the gray sedan's resentment.
And spoiler alert for anyone worried about the cat while listening, the notes mention the cat was found and cared for and recovered. But moving from the heavy responsibility of creating reality, I want to touch on a moment of, well, failure, or at least an admitted error in the session.
The Gibbs material.
Right. So apparently in a previous session, Seth had predicted that Jane would get a teaching job at Elmira College. The prediction was for November 2nd. This session is November 7th. Jane got the rejection letter. She didn't get the job.
And Seth doesn't hide from this at all. He doesn't make excuses or say the timeline shifted or Mercury was in retrograde. He says, the Gibbs material was indeed unabashedly distorted by my friend Rupert.
He throws Jane right under the bus.
He really does. But it is actually a very important teaching moment about mediumship. Seth is an independent consciousness, but he has to come through Jane's physical apparatus. And Jane wanted that job badly. Her ego, her hopes, her fears, they act like static on the radio line.
So when Seth was trying to send the data, Jane's own desire to get the job twisted the signal into a yes.
Exactly. It shows that channeling isn't a perfect, flawless dictation machine. It is a collaboration. And when the channel has a strong emotional stake in the answer, distortion is almost inevitable. It is like trying to hear a whisper in a thunderstorm. Jane's desire was the thunder.
I actually find that incredibly reassuring, because if they were faking it, they would have just never mentioned the failed prediction again. They would have swept it right under the rug, but they highlight it. It adds a thick layer of realism to the whole process.
It does. It shows they are running a laboratory here. They are testing the limits, finding the bugs in the system, and documenting them honestly. It is not a cult personality where the leader is infallible and never wrong. It is a genuine exploration of consciousness, where errors are just part of the data set.
Speaking of data and testing, we have to get to the grand finale of this session, the envelope experiment. This is where we switch from deep philosophy to CSI metaphysics.
This is hands down my favorite part. It validates everything else we have talked about today.
Yep, to set the scene for the learner. What exactly is the envelope experiment?
Okay, picture this. It is 1966. There's no internet, no smartphones. Rob, Jane's husband, has a stack of old newspapers in his studio. He blindly tears a piece out of the Sunday New York Times, seals it between layers of cardboard and double envelopes. He doesn't even look at it himself. He puts it in the envelope, seals it with tape, and hides the rest of the paper.
So nobody knows what is in the envelope. Not Rob, not Jane. It is a true double-blind test.
Correct. Jane goes into a trance, and Seth, using Jane's voice, has to describe what is inside that sealed packet.
This is super high stakes. If he gets it wrong, he is just guessing. But if he gets it right, well, that changes everything. And the accuracy in this session is startling. It is considered one of the really good results. Let's go through the bulletin list of specific hits, because this is the fun part. We need to play detective here. The first one that jumped out at me was the word gubatorial.
Yes. Seth says, Gubatorial, an election of sorts. Jane stumbles over the word, pronouncing it Gubatorial instead of gubernatorial.
And what was actually in the envelope?
The paper was from November 6th, 1966. It was full of Election Day sales. The New York State elections, including the highly contested race for governor, were happening just 2 days later. The paper was completely saturated with the concept of the governor.
So Seth sensed the concept of governor and election, but Jane's brain, which maybe wasn't super familiar with the political word gubernatorial, garbled the transmission slightly.
Think of it like Google Translate. Seth is uploading a raw file of governorness, the feeling of an election. Jane's brain is the search engine. She is scanning her internal dictionary for a match. She doesn't use the word gubernatorial often in her daily life, so her search engine times out and spits out gubatorial. It is a glitch, but it's a glitch that proves the data is coming from outside the system. If she were just physically reading the paper, she would have said the word correctly. The error actually reveals the psychic process.
That is fascinating. Then there is the liberal giving to hit.
Seth says, liberal giving to, two of a kind, liberal giving to. On the physical paper inside the envelope, there was a help wanted ad for Macy's. The headline read, want a job with liberal discounts.
Liberal discounts, liberal giving. That is a direct hit.
And the to reference connects perfectly to twin-size items mentioned in the exact same ad section. He's picking up fragments of text and combining them.
Okay, here's one that felt very visual to me. Seth says, connection with a monstrosity, as of a monstrous building, perhaps old Victorian.
This one is fascinating because it captures the essence of the article, not just literal words. There was a story on that page about prison reform in Portugal. It talked about replacing antiquated prisons, big old scary buildings with modern ones. It described the old prisons as being of a very low standard.
So Seth perceives the energy of an old, scary, bad building and translates it as monstrosity or Victorian.
Right. He is reading the feeling of the text, the emotional tone, not just the letters. He feels the bad vibes of the prison. And his mind, or Jane's mind, searches for an image that matches scary old building. Victorian monstrosity is the closest metaphorical match.
Then we have the religious connection. Seth says, seminary, priest, 1841.
And right there on the page is an article about a Dominican priest building a seminary. The Dominican order was expelled from Portugal in 1834, which is incredibly close to 1841 historically, and readmitted later.
That is unbelievably specific. Seminary and priest aren't things you just find on every single page of the Sunday paper, especially not a random year like 1841.
No, especially not right next to ads for mink coats and blankets.
Speaking of blankets, let's talk about the blue and thermal hit. This one shows how Seth associates ideas.
Seth reports an impression of blue and then an initial explosion or heat.
Heat and explosion.
Rob analyzes this thoroughly later in his notes. The ad was for thermal blankets. Thermal implies heat. To a mind that communicates in symbols and energy, heat can feel like an explosion or intense energy, and the ad specifically listed the color blue.
So Seth sees blue and feels hot or thermal and puts them together. It is almost like synesthesia.
Precisely. It is an associative leap. He is tasting the concepts rather than reading the ink.
And the last one I want to mention is the fashion models. Seth says, buttons and distant connection with a skull or skull shape.
This sounds totally grim until you look at the photos on the page. The page had pictures of fashion models wearing fall coats, which had lots of buttons, but they were wearing these very tight-fitting hats that covered their hair completely.
Making their heads look
like eggs or skulls. The shape was heavily emphasized because the hair was hidden. Seth was describing the visual geometry of the photo without knowing what a fashion model was in that specific context. He saw the pure shape. Round, smooth, skull-like.
It is amazing. He's describing the geometry, the words, the concepts, and the emotional tone of the articles, all from inside a sealed envelope.
It completely validates everything we discussed in the first half of the show. If consciousness can read a newspaper without physical eyes, then consciousness is absolutely not bound by the physical body.
Boom. There it is. The envelope experiment isn't just a fun party trick. It is the proof of concept for the Puerto Rico analogy we started with.
Exactly. If Seth can project his consciousness into that envelope to read the data, then we can project our consciousness into a new life, or out of a body at death. The walls, whether they are paper envelopes or physical bodies, are not barriers to consciousness. They're just mediums we choose to work through.
So, what does this all mean for the learner listening right now? We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We went from Puerto Rico to a cat crash to a psychic reading of the times.
I think the core message here is empowerment and expansion. You are not trapped in your body. You are a traveler inhabiting it. You are not a victim of random events. You are a co-creator of your reality, painting with the brush of your expectations. And your emotions are not just internal feelings. They are powerful tools that shape the world around you, for better or for worse, as we saw with the cat.
It is a profound call to be more awake, to be more conscious of what we are actively projecting every single day.
Yes, to wake up inside the dream, to realize you are in Puerto Rico, so you might as well enjoy the vacation and learn something while you're here. Don't just sleep through it.
And maybe drive a little more carefully, with a little less resentment in your heart.
Absolutely. Clear the windshield of your mind.
We are going to wrap it up there for today. If this deep dive sparked your curiosity, and I honestly don't know how it couldn't, don't stop here. The summaries and our analysis are great, but the source material is where the real magic is.
We have only scratched the surface of session 300. There is so much more nuance in the full text. You should absolutely visit the New Awareness Network website and bookstore at sethcenter.com, the early sessions. Get the books, read the sessions. It is a journey well worth taking.
And here is a final provocative thought for you to carry into your week. We talked about Seth reading the newspaper in a sealed envelope in 1966. He didn't use physical eyes, he used direct perception.
Right.
So what is your consciousness picking up right now, in this very moment, that you are actively ignoring because you are too focused on what your physical eyes are telling you? What is in the sealed envelope of your own life? The hunch you are ignoring, the vibe you are dismissing, that you already know but you just haven't opened yet?
That is a beautiful question worth meditating on. What are you seeing without your eyes?
Until next time, keep your envelope sealed and your mind open.